Thank you. Good morning, and go Packers, Sarah. I I agree with much of that. I think one of the things that we need to be very clear about is how this impact this year of the pandemic is impacting our provinces and our states is very different across the region and across the countries. Where we are interested in this discussion is to make sure that we open up that gateway again between our countries, which I think is what's severely impacted, particularly those of us who are on each other's borders. But to a bigger extent, beyond tourism, for many other economic drivers that we don't even begin to recognize are the periphery of what happens in so many other different industries that they're indirectly impacted by what tourism does. In Idaho, it's been a little bit different than some parts of the country and in the provinces because we're about 65% public lands. So we have a large percentage of recreation areas that aren't privately owned. It brings a lot of tourism to us, particularly within the state. And I know Sarah would find the same kind of statistics up in Alaska. And so we have a tremendous amount of tourism within our own state and within the US. What did impact us, of course, was all our neighbors to the north who like to come down and recreate with us. The one thing we did notice this year, which we were surprised, we have been as a state, Idaho, the fastest growing state in the nation for about 3 years. And this year, because were in phase 4 and everybody around us was in phase 1, they all wanted to join us. And so we had a surge in recreation. And so some sectors, even though they lagged in the first 2 months of like March or April, perhaps into June, we had more people we've ever seen ever in our backyard. And so we saw quite surprisingly, some industries, whether it was real estate or recreational retail or whatever it was the best they'd ever had in decades. And others, of course, much of that service industry that supports tourism, like our bars and restaurants and some of the other service industries, they lagged considerably comparatively. And so it's very hard for us to, at this stage, see the overall impact. Typically, tourism is our third largest economic driver in the state. And we put, I would say, and probably the governor would be unhappy with me, but we put precious little resources or investment into that tourism. We just say, look how beautiful we are, come visit. And so to speak to what Mr. Armstrong said, there's much we can do differently to encourage those cross borders, to make sure that we have a larger presence and a more welcoming presence across, because we don't do near as much as any of the states around us or many of the states across the country. And I think that's something that is a big deficit that we could do differently. That said, some would argue that we have plenty of people visiting us right now, but it's really hard to know how that will pan out. Historically, the tourism industry is about 60,000 jobs. It grew about 13% before this year, so it'll be interesting to see what the statistics are as we go into next year. We get about $12 million in collections of just direct tourism, not indirect tourism. And we have historically had averaged about 3 million travelers. But I think that we are going to see some very skewed statistics that we're going to have to pick our way through. And part of that is because we have grown in the tens of thousands of people who decide to move with us, move here. And not all of them are big recreationists. And it's really hard for me to know what their tourism mentality will be. They've gone to our more urban centers, which would be laughable for many of you in larger places that truly have urban centers, but Boise proper, Twin Falls, Coeur d'Alene, they've all sectors of regions of our state have grown substantially. Some of our second homeowners in my tourism backyard have decided to stay permanently. Most of all the VRBOs and Airbnbs that were largely weekly or 2 weekly are now 6 months and a year. So that whole sector changed. And because we are affordable, we have low crime, a lot of things that are happening that are political upheaval in other parts of the country isn't impacting us yet compared to many of the Western states or some of the US states. And so they want to be here. And so the outcome of what this looks like down the road is still very uncertain. And it will take us a while to pick through how we should probably do our tourism sector better. So that is sort of a little bit different than many other areas of both countries, I think.
Thank you, Senator. That's a very interesting case study that you have live going, I think, right now. Paul, I'm curious, what went through your mind as you heard Peter speak, and what context would you like to share with us this morning?
Yeah, well, I mean, Peter has more perspective and skin in the game than any of us. We're all very invested, but I think it's different for all of us who are servant leaders and those who actually do have their own or other investors' skin in the game. And I think having worked inside a government framework as well too, it is the constant struggle of our industry, and one that we are going to have to come to ground with now after this, where it's viewed dismissively. It's viewed as though it's in spite of the economic impact and the jobs created, other decisions or priorities are taken in advance. So our opportunity now is to really continue to reshape the whole narrative around tourism, and that had been happening prior to the pandemic. There've been much more sophisticated discussions around the role of tourism in driving foreign direct investment. There've been much more stronger understanding, even with officials locally here in Greater Victoria, on the role of conventions and sports tourism and things of that nature. And I saw that across Canada. But when the rubber hit the road, we were pushed to the back of the bus or the back of the train for other purposes. So the opportunity now, as Peter mentioned, is what are those preconditions to get us going again? Because while we do have some great interim solutions around wage subsidies and things of that nature, our businesses need revenue again. And there is this notion that somehow if we all shop locally, that will see us through, but that just isn't the case. We are inherently an export business. One of my former bosses used to say every morning we wake up and we say we're in the business of OPM, other people's money. Export in as a net infusion of cash. So in this period of crisis, we need to work together with government on a deliberate reopening plan with benchmarks, because there are jurisdictions such as Australia, such as Singapore, such as Korea, such as many others that are already months ahead of us. And to your earlier point, Dave, we are now in what would traditionally be the wholesaling season for the next summer season, and we don't even have the beginning of a roadmap back. And to me, that's been the most disappointing part. We've already had 8 months, and we're ready with our relaunch plan here in Victoria, but I don't see a provincial plan and I don't see a federal plan that I can feed into. So I think our opportunity now is to really bear down in the next 2 months, no longer, to shape 2021 and shape 2022, because nothing will replace revenue. We need to get revenue going again when it's safe to do so.
Thank you, Paul. Excellent point. So Sarah, coming in from Alaska, same question. What is your reaction to Peter's comments, and what opening remarks would you like to share with us?
Well, thank you, and thanks for having Alaska as part of this group. I will probably echo many of the comments, but also share some slightly different challenges I think Alaska has experienced as part of trying to recover through this pandemic. As you mentioned, I represent the Alaska Travel Industry Association, where I represent over 600 tourism businesses and community partners that are involved in promoting and managing tourism throughout our state. And early on in the pandemic, our board of directors, our industry, made a commitment with government partners that the health of our visitors and our teams and our communities was our first priority. We worked really well early on with a new partner, the Department of Health and Social Services, and trying to be a voice at that table as they were our governor was issuing necessary health mandates and requirements, because we wanted to be healthy and keep our teams and our communities healthy so that we could look towards recovery sooner rather than later. We also developed early on some high-level industry protocols to help our businesses think about adapting early on to some of the health and safety protocols and working with their state health officials all the way down to their community public health nurses, so that if they were able to reopen and keep open or think about moving towards recovery in 2021, that we were working in conjunction with not only our Department of Natural Resources, our tourism officials, but also our public health officials. It has been kind of a learning lesson, because I think it's a new partner in implementing tourism operations, but we've had a great partnership from the beginning, I believe, with our state administration. A little bit of differences, but that I think lead to the challenges and the outcomes I'd like to see from all of us working together. In Alaska, we also had resident travel, as Senator Sennett mentioned, and we promoted during the summer, if you can buy locally, include, exploring your own home state. And I would say that there were businesses that benefited from that, not to the extent that I heard Senator Sennett describe, and that's because in Alaska, really all of our entryways for travel and tourism were impacted. We normally are driven by our cruise ship visitation, which is over 60% of our travelers, and then airline and road travel. And almost all, 99.9% of cruise ship sailings were canceled this summer season. The border has closed with Canada, which has limited road travel or severely impacted tourism and road travel through Alaska and up through our region. And then airline travel has been impacted. Although we do see hopes for recovery as visitors looking at air and road travel as more safe, or the first sectors as being more. And so I think that leads to us working together on having those consistent protocols or needs of the community to share with the travel industry, so that we can be ready to stay open and continue to reopen as we recover from this pandemic. And I will address just one last thing, in that a normal year in Alaska, the tourism industry is a huge economic contributor to our state's and our community's economy. In a normal year, we project that overall economic activity generates over $4 billion, and that includes direct and indirect revenue from businesses, employment taxes, as well as visitor fees and taxes. That's over 100 million, we estimate, to the state's coffers, and between 80 and 90 million to local communities in taxes and fees. And without that, as we continue through this and into the new year, into spring and the next summer season, many communities, if travel businesses aren't able to open, even slowly at first, or stay open, that'll impact a lot of the economies, both at the state level and our province levels and at local community levels. So I'll agree with the rest of the panelists that I think we need now more than ever to work together as a region. There are other destinations around the world, and even in the United States and in Canada, that are already investing in safety protocols and marketing efforts, because this is the booking season for the summer season. And I think both of those points, both of those opportunities present themselves if we are able to work together and move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Those are excellent comments. And, the Pinware region has amazing tourism inventory, and we know that visitors come and want to move easily around the region, and that mobility across the border, both within our countries and internationally, is something that our tourism working group has been discussing, along with the border working group and the transportation working group. And all of those issues are coming to a head under COVID. It feels like 30 years of momentum are at risk with this particular stand down. So Just a question out to the panelists to get our discussion going. What do you think is at risk right now? What are we at risk of losing in our region's travel and tourism industry if it fails? Is there a risk for our region culturally if we lose key experiences and transportation links? Is there a deeper impact that maybe residents and legislatures are taking for granted a little bit, that tourism contributes to communities that's at risk if tourism gets diminished? Any thoughts about that? Maybe Paul?
Well, Dave, I mean, I don't mean to be dramatic, but I think everything's at risk, and it all depends on how logically and orderly we can reopen next year. You know, private sector operators cannot go 2 years on a zero revenue basis. It's without major restructuring. If you think of the very fabric of the Pacific Northwest region, I do think of things like the MV Coho ferry service. I think of our connections bilaterally with seaplanes and with you know, trains and transportation. That is a sinew that links not only the tourism industry together, but also our broader trade and you know, cross-border and inter-regional economy together. And you know, the Pacific Northwest was and still is a bit of has a frontier ethic. We've evolved in terms of our economy into many different tertiary industries, but there still is a vast sense of exploration of nature, of open space. And if we can't have transportation linkages connect those together, then I think the very essence of who we are could be damaged. So there's big stakes here in terms of a logical reopening, and it goes beyond just the tourism economy.
Here, so maintaining those key connections that we've taken for granted for years. That's an excellent point. Any other comments from the panelists?
The thing that popped in my mind listening to Paul is we have to remember how interconnected we are. Yeah. The large population bases we draw from are a long way from us, and we have to give people a meaningful reason to come into our region. So we you know, Alaska depends on BC, but we depend on Alaska. We depend on Seattle. When we have major events like the World's Fair and things like that, we all benefit in the region. So working together is very important. And Paul's 100% right. We got to maintain the connections to the outside markets to make sure people can get here. One of my big fears is, will there be a cruise ship industry, and how long will it take to recover? The airline industry here in Canada, we're not being as proactive on saving the industry as our American colleagues. So there are, you know, we have to be realistic about some of the issues we have in our region and why it's so important that we work together.
That's an excellent point.
Can I jump in, Dave?
Go ahead.
Just quickly, I think, you know, the cultural and the quality of life reasons are definitely important in those transportation sectors. And I just wouldn't I just think we should also mention the many small to medium-sized business owners that could lose their business. And it's not just about economics, but that's a huge part of it. These are folks' livelihoods that they've been in for sometimes 10, 20, 30 years. And there's a trickle-down effect there of losing your own business, not being able to hire seasonal or year-round employees from residents or other workforce pools that they've hired year over year. And also with those connections with other industry that are connected to the travel industry, it impacts that workforce and those economies as well.
It's an excellent point. And we have a question from a panelist about the opportunity of creating travel bubbles. Perhaps we've heard that tourism resumption may not be like a light switch, it may be more like a dimmer switch, and are travel bubbles an opportunity for us as we restart tourism to set up reciprocal travel between safe destinations? Do we see this as being feasible within the industry? This is a question from Sida from the audience.
Maybe if I could just start tackling that, because I've been following this very closely, Dave. It's happening elsewhere in the world. It's happening successfully elsewhere in the world. And so I think we'd be pretty remiss in fact, I'd say we'd be derelict in our duty if we didn't explore it. It will require bilateral cooperation, and it will require technology more than I've seen deployed to date. But, you know, we're going to reopen in concentric rings or maybe different bubbles, but the sooner we can get trading markets open again, the more certainty it will lead to future opening. And this is a time for well-researched pilot projects. If we can demonstrate that something is happening, such as what's happening at Calgary Airport in terms of testing protocol, and there's evidence behind it, there is no reason for a policymaker not to replicate it elsewhere if the conditions on the ground make sense. But this is the kind of innovation and courage that we're going to need in the months ahead. So I would say travel bubbles are certainly worth exploring. They've been working for months now in other parts of the world.
Yeah, I think, you know, this conference is about looking forward to the future of the travel economy. Maybe this is a resiliency that we can build in for other disruptive events. That's an excellent point.
If I might, David?
Go ahead, Michelle.
Sorry, thank you. Just as a point of clarification in my opening comments, I had mentioned statistics about percentage of tourism and economics. That was not for the state, that was purely for the Sun Valley region. And I bring that up because I'm noticing, well, in my state and probably Montana and some others, it's not as easy right now even to get in. We have very small airports. They're not easily accessible like some other industries or some other places in the same industries. And so we will have to make sure that it has been exacerbated by airlines, but most of all of our traffic does come in through the roadways. And so some of those won't be as impacted, but I'm noticing to Paul's point that, and I'm pleased to see that rather than being, not to say they aren't competitive, but so hyper competitive amongst industries, like let's say the ski industry, they're getting together and comparing notes about how they can safely roll out their industry, regardless of where they are. And because they're gonna have to be very creative to make sure that they don't stick everybody in a gondola and, you know, have huge food courts in their lodges. And there are just so many different constraints besides the openness of being on the mountain that allows for tourists to move around freely. So I think a lot of what we're hearing is how industries are sharing the ability to get their best ideas forward so that all of that industry does its best work and welcoming during the season. And I think that can be down the road potentially very helpful. But each location, of course, it's going to have its constraints, and ours, unfortunately, is that tourism, that transportation component.
Right. It's an excellent point. I like the welcoming theme that you keep using. I'm just curious, if we look back at other past black swan events that have impacted tourism, do any past lessons come to mind from the veterans in the crowd that, again, we're trying to look forward to restarting tourism in a resilient and sustainable way? I think of 9/11, when there was a lot of messaging from government to the traveler that had quite appalling effect. Are there some past learnings that we need to implement as we restart tourism? Paul, any thoughts, or Peter?
Start with one thought, and maybe Peter or others or Sarah could build on it. But I remember in the days after 9/11, and I was, you know, an early mid-level manager at the time. But there were, you know, thinkers and leaders who were suggesting that we were never going to travel again, and that the industry faced an existential crisis. And that turned out to be the furthest thing from the truth. In fact, there was massive pent-up demand in 2002, was until recently Canada's best tourism year ever. We know, and I see very significant pent-up demand in all segments, whether that be meetings and conferences, sports tourism, tour operators and wholesalers. They're calling me every day looking for ideas, and my team. And our region is incredibly well positioned. We will recover sustainably. We just need a bridge to get there. So what concerns me is when we hear people say, "Oh, the business is going to be, you know, existentially changed." We're going to have to adapt for sure, but there's no writing us off. We'll be coming back, and we need partners to help us get there.
Okay.
I like what Paul said about the industry needs a bridge. There's no question every aspect of the tourism industry, from the small shops to big enterprises, are impacted. And what I said in my opening comments was, one of the things I think we need to look at is the financial liquidity issue that's confronting all the businesses. And an idea that's been talked about, but maybe it should be elevated to governments, is what can they do to help? Maybe what they could do is to say, if you've had a business and you've paid tax in the last 5 years, we'll lend that back to you. We'll be a lender to you and on some kind of terms of basis. At least that's fair and equitable. If a company has paid $1,000 in tax over the last 5 years, they get $1,000 back to use to keep their business alive under certain rules and conditions. What's so different about this Black Swan event versus others is most of the past were relatively short timeframes. We saw the end of it. We knew at 9/11, okay, we're going to have more security, and the government's responded very appropriately. In this one, we don't know what it is. So I just keep reminding, we have to clearly understand what the conditions to operate will be so people can make rational business decisions.
And if I can, I'll just add on to the industry perspective. What I hear is exactly what Peter mentioned, that our industry continues to tell us, from small business to large, they need liquidity now as one bridge or tool to continue to recover and come out of this pandemic. And then the second priority is tourism promotion dollars. So where they won't have the individual extra cash to market themselves, they will look to overall statewide, province, regional level organizations to help keep information in the marketplace, because now is the time people are, with that pent up travel feeling, going to look at, as it becomes more and more safe to travel as we get through this, where to book their next vacation. And I also agree with Paul that I think our region, including Alaska, may fare better because we have those public lands, we have wide open spaces, and people will look to that perception as a safe place where they can travel next.
Dave, if I might add, I do want to second Peter and Sarah. It is not going to run through smoothly. As Sarah mentioned, many of our industries, even with the stimulus that came from the federal government, and Idaho also infused state dollars, some of it repurposed from COVID dollars from the federal government, but they created their own small business grants that you could apply for, many pieces of it, not whole sectors, but you could apply for it. That did help, but it is unsustainable and uncertain still, because many have had to close, as Sarah said, because they just couldn't keep their employees. And if they had to close down and try to open back up, some people received unemployment money, and it was sort of haphazard if they could go back to work, or whether it penciled in financially for them. I mean, there were so many different nuances, and it was not well thought through, partly because it was an immediate crisis, that I think it rolled out so unevenly that we're still struggling to figure out how we as government can be helpful and still stay out of the way. And I think that we are going to spend the next probably year, but at least the next 6 months for sure, figuring out where we can be helpful, like Peter said, with tax breaks or finances. That is something that we can still budget for, because many states are in a real pickle with their budgets because of the pandemic, and still be able to give as much head for tourism and other industries to recover.
So the headline I'm getting is tourism still needs rescue, and we need industry and government to have good dialogue about what's going to be meaningful and helpful. That's very clear. So we have a question from the audience that I'd like to start picking apart, which is what do we really need to do cross-border to influence our provincial and state officials to restart tourism? So what do we need to start doing today to deliberately plan for a successful and safe restart tourism? And what does safe tourism look like into the future?
So Dave, while we're still talking about rescue, there also needs to be deliberate planning for recovery and reopening. And so we're talking from an industry perspective here about a deliberate restart plan and restart committees and working collaboratively. And that conversation needs to kick off. I do know for certain it is happening around the world. And I referenced this earlier, but every day that this doesn't happen is a day wasted. So it's a matter of the various industry associations, the owners with skin in the game, making their voices, heard. And we've been patient through this period. We've shut down as a public health response, but it's been 8 months now, and it's really, really time to work together on creating those conditions and those gates towards reopening again. So we can do those in our own states and provinces. And I'm in contact, and I'm sure everyone else who works in different associations, with colleagues in the Pinwheel region. I spend a lot of time with my counterpart in Seattle, Vancouver, Calgary, and we spend a lot of time working and creating a network. And that just needs to amp up even further.
Good point. Any other thoughts from the panelists about what we can start doing today to start deliberately planning for the restart of tourism?
Dave, I'd come at the question a little bit differently. I find it unbelievable the government does not reach out to us as an industry and start a dialogue. And it goes back to one of the points I made. We haven't earned their respect. So how do we get their respect and their desire to want to work with us? I mean, in BC, it's 19,000 businesses. So these are 19,000 taxpayers, 19,000 voters, at least, that aren't being listened to. And we represent about 10% of the overall economy. So I find it stunning. And we have to ask ourselves first why they're not doing it, and then hold them account and say, we're ready. We want to have a dialogue. Yeah. But today we don't have a minister of tourism. We don't even have a minister of finance. We just went through a ridiculous election in the middle of a pandemic when we needed leadership. So we're looking for leadership from a government that is incapable of leading right now. And we need, so we should use this time to make sure we make our asks as smart and aligned with what they're capable of doing.
So I'm getting the sense from the panelists that industry and government are perhaps not 100% aligned on the importance and value of tourism. And that's an interesting starting point for a very important discussion about rebooting tourism. What do we need to do, Peter, to get industry and government working productively for tourism? How can we do better together?
I think we should have frank, open discussions and ask them the simple question: why don't you respect us? What are we doing? Why would you look after other industries that are smaller than us and be more responsive to their needs than ours?
Okay.
I will. Can I just? Yeah, I was just going to jump in purely from Alaska's perspective, just from our state's perspective. I think throughout this and from the beginning, our administration has sought industry's voice with supporting the testing that has happened at Anchorage or Alaska airports, from Anchorage to Fairbanks and other smaller airports, where our team here at ATIA helps support traveler inquiries around the testing requirements that our administration put on, and they sought our input on what would work or not, or how to provide that information to potential travelers that were traveling during this time. But I will say that overall, in or not in a pandemic, I think the argument and the message that we always advocate to our elected officials at the state or federal level is the economic return that our industry can bring back to state and local economies. And then to Paul's point, I completely echo that as an industry, we're looking to government and to like the CDC for what do you need from us, whatever sector of our industry, to be able to operate safely. And then I can't emphasize enough the point of partnering with our public health officials. In Alaska, we're very challenged by health capacity for some of our rural communities that not only rely on Anchorage, but then when Anchorage becomes our largest city at capacity, we rely on our friends in Washington and Seattle and other states. So I think that continuing to work with our public health officials, our departments of health and social service, as well as the departments of transportation and departments of natural resources, there needs to be new partnerships with industry and government to be able to take those steps to reopen.
Okay, these are great perspectives, and I think about the good work that Alaska's done with the rapid testing and the different approaches among the different states and provinces in PNWR. So as we move forward, is one key message to the government centered around harmonization of protocols or in our approach to tourism? I get concerned as an operator that deals with visitors that come from all over the world that there's going to end up being different regulations in different supply chains. So is this something we should be talking about that we need government to understand?
If I might, Dave, I think this is our big problem with any industry, not only tourism, is the haphazardness in which each state, understanding that the infection rates with the pandemic are different and resources are different. But you can't keep disagreeing about what phase you should be and be inconsistent and then go ahead and roll an industry out, and then suddenly you get smacked with cases and your infection rate gets so big that you roll them back to another phase, which just happened in Idaho. We were at phase 4 during the summer. Sun Valley was the most infected place per capita in the nation for about 2 months. We did all the proper protocols of shutting it down and isolating and making sure that we got some kind of herd immunity, so that sustained us over the summer. But now we're seeing that we went from phase 4 to phase 3 to phase 2, which means that starts to constrain industry, all industry. And you can't keep doing that inconsistency and keep bouncing back and recovering. And yet everybody else around us stayed in a uniform phase, and so everybody kept to us, and so that helped for the short term, understanding we want people to get back to their economics and have a path forward and be able to recover. But we don't even have our health districts agreeing from county to county about how they will handle the pandemic. And there's huge political disagreement, not only in our state, but around the country, about whether we should even bother to worry about the pandemic or not. But you can't do that to industry. There has to be a consistency. And I think that is going to be a really large problem to get whole regions to decide that they're going to work collaboratively and consistently so that we can keep consistently roll something out that's meaningful.
Yeah. That's excellent context. So we are marching through our hour, and I'd like to get to something that is, I know, on the minds of my colleagues. It's certainly on my mind, and that's traveler confidence. And I'm just wondering what you think. Is there an opportunity for government and industry to coordinate on a strong opening day message that now it's safe to travel? Is there this opportunity for the PNWR region to come out of COVID and brand ourselves with a safe travel stamp like the World Travel and Tourism Council is advocating? Is this something that industry and government need to work together on? Does government have a role in helping us with a consistent message to residents to embrace tourism and to get the potential traveling public confident again in traveling once it's safe to do so? What are your thoughts?
I'll be really quick, Dave, but I think government agencies shut the industry down and sent some very clear messages around travel. So it's imperative that there's going to need to be a partnership around, especially when borders reopen. There were some very strong and I would say not always consistent messages sent. And what I'm most proud of is how our industry adapted. We know that the virus was spread in the March period, by overseas travel and by some conferences. But in the period from May, April, June, our industry adapted and has taken health and safety so seriously. And I know in British Columbia, we operated incredibly safely throughout the summer. And that is a story that needs to be told. And that is, how absolutely vital our employees and our owners are taking this. So again, back to Pierre's point about earning trust and knowing those preconditions, we have a period of time here where we can really work together. If you do this, then you earn the opportunity to take the next step. And if you can demonstrate that, then you meet this threshold in terms of health and safety. And then when people are comfortable, we can have a clear and consistent message. And it's going to be absolutely vital. There is stamps and branding, but it needs to be authentic and it needs to be genuine. And our health authorities and our elected officials do need to have that genuine confidence that we're ready to deliver safely again and not just be viewed as a necessary sector for employment and taxation revenue.
Okay. Other thoughts? I have one last question, Sarah.
I'll just jump in briefly and say that we've talked about the pent up demand for travel, and we know in industry and we consider ourselves in the front lines of marketing to our customers, but appreciate that when you have a head of state or government officials say it's safe again, it lends more credibility to your message. And I would look at that as an opportunity to partner when it does become bit by bit safe to travel, to look to our government partners to help us share that with travelers.
Excellent point.
So David, one of the thoughts I have listening to all this is as an industry, we're incredibly resilient, and we've got through other black swan events and other things. This is so unique, but the fundamentals of our industry are that we are very creative, we are very responsive, we consider other people, and I think among ourselves, we can find the solutions that will help guide us out of our problems. We need to stand together. We need to stand together proudly. And we need to demand, in some ways, the respect of government to help us get out of the problems that we're in. They didn't put us there. We didn't put us there. But we need their help. And somehow we have to have that honest dialogue and say, why aren't you respecting us? We respect you. Now we need your help.
Okay, I think that's an excellent button to land on. Unfortunately, it's a very quick hour for us to go through what is a very, very important topic for the Pinwur region. And I think coming out of this morning, there was some very honest discussion here about how industry and government need to come together eye to eye around the importance of tourism. Because we really have to do some planning now in order to survive. The idea around safe travel bubbles, reciprocal travel between safe destinations. There are ideas. We are resilient, as Peter just said. We are very innovative, but I think we all feel the sense of urgency as the booking window for 2021 flies past us. In the future, post-COVID, I think there's more discussion to be had around border technology and how we're going to leverage that for the future to make our industry even more bioresilient and safe for the world and welcoming. So to close, I would like to thank our dedicated Pinwur sponsors and thank the panelists for their discussion today.